guys. You know, one of the challenges of life is found in even that little chorus that we sang, Lord, you are more precious than silver. That is fairly easily sung. Is it true? You know, it's objectively true. You know, I mean, it is a true statement. It is a true sentiment. Do we make it true in our lives, and therein lies the real challenge? Not sure where to start this morning. A couple of interesting things. I find that since my accident a year ago or so, I can't sing sometimes. I mean, I can get maybe the octave lower or the octave higher, or you know, whatever, but I can't sing like I used to be able to. Well, of course, I never was, you know, going to be able to make the stage, but it's kind of one of those interesting things. So I find myself kind of warbling between various notes there, and my voice doesn't go where I want to. So okay, so here's the thing where we have a little audience participation where you get to fill in the end of the story, maybe somewhat. We have an option today of a 3 or 4 hour garden variety sermon, or a little bit about the trip that I just had this week, and some of the scriptural and biblical lessons to be derived from that. So how many are for the sermon? Okay, how many want to hear a little bit about the trip?
Yeah.
Well, all right then. Well, so most of you know, many of you know, maybe all of you know, I don't know, that I just returned from a 6-day horsepacking trip with a guy named Jacob Carroll. How many of you have ever met Jacob? Any of you when you're running around? Well, he has fairly recently moved to the Valley from Southern California. He was a businessman in the financial world, and then the collapse came 8 or 9 years ago, 10 years ago, whenever it was that it came, and it just, you know, the wheels came off in his world in a whole gob of ways. And so it's quite a story, but interestingly, then they moved here, and he has a heart to have a ministry, and he has called it Tend the Fire Ministry. And it is a men's ministry based around the idea of adventure and being out in the wilderness and spending time with a fairly small group of guys at a time, doing things that, you know, manly men do, and kind of getting a chance to sit around the fire and really talk about family and faith and life and responsibility and all that stuff. So maybe about a year ago, through a series of kind of thing, I got in touch with him. He got in touch with me, actually, through one of the local pastors in Whitefish that had encountered him. So we had a meeting, and when he discovered, you know, that I had horses, that was why he wanted to meet with me, because one of the things on his heart and mind was he would like to do a horsepacking trip, or several, if he could, in a given time. They do rafting and they do mountain climbing and all kinds of other stuff too, but one of the things that he wanted to do was to offer a horse packing trip. So with my critters and all that and the gear and equipment and all that, it was kind of a natural thing, and so that's what was taking place this last week. I was hoping that the guys were all going to be in church last Sunday morning, because the original plan was that we're going to come to my house early in the morning, 6 o'clock, get everything all bundled up, put the horses actually in the trailer, show up at church, you know, and then blast out of here to make it to the trailhead and all that kind of business and try to make it even into camp. But the guys woke up Sunday morning, 3 of them were just sick. I mean, throwing up sick. And so they were just not doing well. They showed up at my place right after church, but they were still sick and hurt. And so those that could loaded up all the gear and tacked up all the horses and loaded them up and all that kind of stuff. And I think we finally got out of town about 3:15 or so. But it was, I'm glad some of you were praying for us, and we had prayer ahead of that. It's kind of amazing how shared adventure and shared misery and shared challenges and shared gut-wrenching terror can bond, you know, guys particularly. I don't know if ladies get bonded in that similar kind of fashion. But how much a trip such as this can relate to other aspects of life. And I really believe that these guys were eternally impacted. Hopefully, that certainly is the goal and the mission and the vision. We were accompanied by 2 police officers from Southern California, one of whom is a former Navy SEAL, and 2 guys working in the world of financial advisors. And I had never met any of them but Jacob, and Jacob and I had never spent a lot of time together, but we'd had several conversations, and Jacob had met 1 or possibly 2 of these guys, so it was a complete unknown quantity when these guys come rolling in. They got in Friday afternoon. And tend the fire ministry is that, as I've kind of expressed, that ministry with, you know, sometimes there's ministries to a lot of guys, you know, promise keepers, you know, fill the stadium, you know, which was a cool thing back in the day. And then, but this was kind of a microcosm of taking a few guys and having more of an intensive kind of connection and relationship. I don't think that Jacob had any idea precisely how intensive it might end up being, but anyway, it was a fascinating trip. So the trip had been planned for about a year, but when you start trying to put the wheels on something like this, there's just a lot of stuff that most people have no idea about. It's kind of like operating church. You know, if a person just comes zinging in and has church, well, it's fine. You know, they say, okay, that was nice, or that was not nice, or I didn't like what he said, or I thought it was okay what he said, like the music, you know, whatever. But there's a lot that goes into being able to make it happen, and such is the same with a trip like this. Anyway, the desire of this ministry is that guys will go home and get involved in small group men's ministry to encourage one another along and stir one another along, whatever. Those of you who have been to Tres Dias, that's one of the things that is kind of a value, saying, look, you know, we need to walk through life together. Let's find people to walk through life together. And we see that happening among men, and particularly, and I don't know, the ladies maybe in a little less degree, but for the men anyway. So there was a lot of interesting challenges to get this trip going. Some of you know a little bit about some of the challenges that come about trying to pull off a Tres Dias weekend. There is often a lot of spiritual warfare ahead of time. I mean, there are just things that happen that are weird, and you go, what is up with this business? Right? I mean, have you experienced that? You go, man, they're just, why are we all of a sudden being bombarded here? Well, Jacob's wife just recently, suddenly out of the blue, was diagnosed with cancer and had to have a quick surgery, and a pretty heavy-duty surgery. So this is a massive challenge of life that just happened, in addition to all the other stuff. You know, he was in business, and, you know, when the fat hit the fire, there was all kinds of stuff, and he was telling some of his story around the campfire about how he was being sued for millions of dollars by all kinds of people, and all kinds of false things were said about him and all that, and so we could really resonate there. But I currently have 8 horses, 6 of whom are pretty well schooled. They know the drill, they know the trail, they've been there, done that. 2 are younger, one of which I took a dive off of last year about this time, as some of you remember the excitement and joy of that little happening. The other one is a challenge. And Sundance, the one I came off of, just got ridden by a friend of mine who actually went in on a trip a year ago with me just before my accident. And so he volunteered to take these 2 3-year-olds and get them ready, you know, to ride and what have you. Well, he concentrated on Sundance because she was easier. So last Thursday, just before the trip, I went to get my 2 3-year-olds, bring them home, at the same time, just about exactly, that Jacob picked up a borrowed trailer and picked up 2 borrowed horses to bring over to our place to try to get them acclimatized with the herd. So if you know anything about horses, you know that that can produce an interesting challenge when you start mixing a herd of folk and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so I just got Sundance back and got on her in the round corral, where the last time I was there did not end well. I don't know if you can comprehend some of the angst that that might have generated, but I can assure you that it did generate some. So Jacob always had borrowed the 2 other horses, also a challenge. They were supposed to be good to ride or pack or do anything, and actually it turned out that they really were. However, at least one of them does not play well with others. And so that also raises the bar of excitement and what have you, and really has a way of phasing out boredom. A good deal of entertainment and drama. I have an additional foal that is just a few months old that I had to take along because I had to have her mama. And so that adds another layer of, you know, kind of things to it. So I don't know if you're able to begin to get a sense that there was a perfect storm of challenging opportunities being presented here. Friday, the day before, well, the Friday before the trip, they just got off the airplane, these guys. Jacob brought them over so that we could try to get them matched with a horse and matched with the tack and all that stuff. So, and then we were going to go for a little ride. Well, I did not know anything about these guys, and so I kind of picked them out by size and put them on horses and all that kind of business and got it set up, and so we went for a little ride, but we hadn't got 100 yards before one of the guys, you know, one of my horses took a couple quick little steps, and so, man, he panicked and locked his legs together and kind of went yee-haw and did everything you could do wrong, you know, not knowing the difference, and I didn't know the difference. So she started, you know, doing odd things, and he ended up taking a dive off of the horse, and, you know, he didn't get injured, but he did get, it wasn't fun. So he decided he's not riding one of these critters into the bog, he's going to walk, which the first day he did walk, and carrying a heavy pack and all that was an interesting challenge, one of the police officers. So, anyway, later I found out, sitting around the fire and so forth, that his wife, they had been in Hawaii, and his wife had been injured riding a horse. They were going to ride horses on the beach. Horse went under a branch or whatever and just crunched her back. So she was in the hospital for days, and you know, it was an odd and interesting challenge. So he was really, I don't know that terrified is the right term, but it's probably on that edge of the scale. I didn't know that, and this did not help the situation. So Sunday came, and I had hoped the crew was coming to church, like I say, but they woke up sick. I mean sick. But they showed up, we got everything together, and threw the horses and the gear all on the trailer, and finally got out of town about 3:15 in the afternoon. And we started off, and we got through Columbia Falls, and before we got to the canyon, we had a flat tire on the borrowed trailer. So here we are stuck beside the road with a borrowed trailer, no spare, naturally, you know, all that kind of stuff. So now what are we going to do? We're stuck beside the road and all that sort of thing. So long story short, Jacob ended up calling another guy and getting borrowing another trailer. So we pulled this trailer and the horses into a lady's yard that was very nice and friendly and had some horses so we could park it there, and you know, but all this was burning up time. Meanwhile, my knee is pretty floppy, as some of you have seen it a little floppy again now, and so the guy that was the Navy SEAL said, well, I've seen this and done this before and stuff like that. We just need to get a syringe and some needles in case we need to, you know, do something with it in the bob. So I called all over town, and finally there was a pharmacy open. Rena went and got the needles and stuff and brought them out. And never had to use them because my knee went back down and was wonderful. So go figure. But that was a part of the excitement and joy of the early day. So then we finally got on the trail. It's about a 4 or 5 hour pull. By the time we got there, it was late, it was dark. Now we got all the horses, we got to get out, we're going to camp at the trailhead. Got to break out the tents. 3 of the guys are sick. So we're dealing with, 10 horses and all that kind of business and camping. And it was a little chilly that night for the California crew, so that added an additional layer of excitement and joy. So we got up Monday morning, and 3 of the guys could hardly stand up other than to dash to the bathroom and throw up and all that kind of stuff. So the other guys were trying to load the gear. I'm dealing with all the horses because they don't know which end of the horse you feed for the most part. So here we are trying to get this stuff together. So these guys are packing up all of this stuff. And when I mean all of this stuff, I mean they were packing up all this stuff. They were putting big bags of stuff in other little bags to try to get it on. And I was trying to get them to weigh it and all that kind of stuff. But man, it was an ugly looking thing. One of the guys ended up actually bringing a glass, yes, a glass goblet on the trip. And also insisted, and kind of unbeknownst to me, on bringing several large blocks of ice in a cooler. So it is not all that easy to pack some of this stuff. And these guys didn't really know how to pack anyway. So when we pulled out a benchmark, it was an unusual configuration of borrowed gear and borrowed horses and borrowed equipment and green horses and green guys. And they were green at several points. They were green in terms of knowing nothing, and 3 of them were green in terms of sick. So we started out, and finally we got on the road, I don't know, 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Monday, and we start in. But because some of the guys wanted to ride a particular horse, and they didn't know the difference, and they wouldn't really hear me tell them how we should do this, we put packs on probably the best riding horse in the crowd, and which was fine, she was willing to pack, but it was just a little out of sequence. And so, then we had one of the horses, and one of my 3-year-olds was carrying on and charging around here and there, and she was, so that was adding another layer of stuff. And of course, when you first start out, those of you that have done any horse packing, sometimes the first mile or 2, if you survive, the rest of it can go a lot more smoothly. Well, things did not go all that smoothly. So we got to the place where finally, almost everything that can go wrong is going wrong, right? It's one of those sorts of things. We were a couple miles in, or a mile and a half, whatever it was in. A couple of the pack horses had gotten loose and were wandering through the woods with the one behind pushing the one ahead. And so here they are, and these guys didn't know what to do there. I get everybody off the horse I can, have them tie up their horses as best they can. They don't know how to tie a knot. And here we are beside the trailer. The one guy is walking, and he got a little bit ahead of us because we would catch him whenever we'd start off, but then of course we'd have to stop. And so he was up there waiting, so there were just the 5 of us. And finally we got the horse. I said, guys, we just need to stop and pray a minute and see what are we supposed to do here. This is, okay, so we got, adversity, what does that mean? Is God trying to tell us something like you just need to go home and, sit by the pool, if we had a pool? Or do we need to press on? What do we need to do here? And one of the guys was saying, yeah, I'm ready to go back. Let's get a motel back in Shoto and, and see what happens. Let's get, But the former Navy SEAL said, and I was trying to say, look, I don't have a dog in the fight here. I'm with you. Whatever y'all want to do, I'm with you. But he was saying, let's just press on. We can make it. Well, that was what we opted to do. But we prayed, asked the Lord to give wisdom and direction and all that kind of stuff. Changed horses, put people on the horses where, we could pull them in a line. And, things went much better the rest of the way. Still took us 7 hours to get into the camp. So, long day before, long night, sick, and then on top of that, later in the afternoon, a 7-hour ride into the camp. So it was, you know, a long, long, long day. We came rolling into a camp that I had envisioned because I had been there a year ago, just before my accident, and there was grass that tall, and it was wonderful. I thought, yeah, well, we wheeled in there this time, and other people have been there, and there was grass that tall, and it was one here and one there, and not so much, but here we are. So we had to set up camp. Well, I left then because the guy that was walking was some distance back. We had a radio, but it had quit. So I said, well, I'll go back and get him. And that was an interesting moment. I rode back, and boy, he was really, really happy to see me. Because we're in grizzly country. These guys from Southern California were, you know, they didn't know they were armed, but man, he had a good deal of angst. He's out there by himself in the wilderness, not sure even really where to go, but I told him, well, when you get to this trail, you want to hang a left and go down by the river, you know. So he was walking along this trail by himself, so he was happy to see me. So I got off and walked along with him the rest of the way in, and we had just an interesting visit. Was able to explain the plan of salvation. He had very little, and he was asking these great, great leading questions, you know. So that was just really one of the initial interesting God moments that probably would not have happened without all of the trauma and the drama. You with me? Okay? And so we get into camp, all that kind of stuff. Well, meanwhile, we had one of the guys that had grown up in Idaho, and he knew a little bit about horses, so he had to be leading pack horses. He was one of the guys that was well, but the pack horse, he was leading the other borrowed pack horses, and they didn't get along well with the horse that was leading, so that was an interesting challenge. Jacob had to be riding one of my horses and leading my horses, but he had not done that before either. And so, you know, all the way around the board, everybody was in a challenging environment that was really a stretching situation. But if we're going to go forward, you got to cowboy up and make it happen, you know, which is a part of the challenge of life. We like to have things oriented around our comfort. I mean, I think all of us do. We want to be comfortable. We want to have life easy as best we can. And this was something that took us out of that comfort zone, in some cases by a gigantic stretch. And I think turned out, hopefully, to produce what this particular trip was maybe designed to do. So we got into camp, and Tuesday then, the next morning, the guys were feeling a little better, but they were not near 100%. So we kind of stayed around camping and talked about what to do. Do we need to move the camp because there's no feed? You know, and finally devised a way for the horses to get out and feed, you know, among the trees and stuff where there was still some graze, and that was an interesting challenge. There's a whole lot of stuff about that was kind of interesting. Wednesday we got up and the guys were much better, and the idea was to go up to a place called Prairie Reef. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it, but it is just cooler than average. You know, you climb this mountain and there's a lookout station up there, but man, you just see the world and all kinds of interesting geological features and what have you. And actually, when you look down over there, there's a plane that was wrecked 55 years ago that, you know, that's another whole story, but that was interesting. So we rode up, and the guy that had not ridden yet faced his fears, got on the horse. We led the horse up, but he stayed on the horse. We got up close to the top of the mountain, and he actually got on by himself and was, you know, was letting the horse go. So that was, you know, really a huge step. But when we got up to the top and the guys could see what they could see, they were just blown away. I mean, it is just, it is so phenomenal to see the sights. You can see 360 degrees, and it's a sheer drop off, you know, on one whole side, and you can look out and see the China Wall and stuff like that. You know, it's one of those, just one of those places that is so stinking cool that it's worth the trip to get there. And the guys, I think, all at that point began to, you know, realize that it was work, it was pain, it was trauma, but very, very cool. So we came back down the hill, and one of the guy had little chairs for everybody. I've never seen these little chairs. I need to buy some or get some, steal some or whatever. Anyway, they were great. You could unfold those babies and sit them around the fire or whatever. Well, I was dealing with the horses and all that kind of stuff, and all of a sudden the guys were saying, well, we're going to the river. So we were camped right on the river. It was probably that deep, but you know, I don't know, wider than the room maybe, and so it was just a cool situation. So they took the chairs out in the river and sat, you know, just kind of in a circle, sitting in the river, you know, taking a bath kind of, and doing, you know, just doing the kind of stuff that you would do after a hot day, climbing the mountain and coming back and all. And as we sat around the circles, and guys began to tell their story. We're sitting out here in the Bob Marshall wilderness in the middle of this river, you know, talking about their journey and where they've been and how they got where they got and how they were raised and all those things. And that was a theme throughout sitting around the fire at night or various things. It was an amazing thing. Those of you that have been, well, to a Tres Dias or other kind of environment where you get to hear one another's stories and connect with people. It just was a powerful time of connecting in relationship. So that was, then on Thursday, we were going to go up and ride up and see the wall. But the guys were about thrashed. The former Navy SEAL said, hey, let's you and me go. And I would have been happy to do that, but it would have been a long ride. It would have been a 10 or 12 mile ride one way, and then we would have had to come back. And Jacob decided that he wanted to keep the whole crew together, and so we went fishing up the river. So here we went up this gorgeous river, just fishing and looking, you know, I mean, again, just a phenomenal time. The guys caught several fish, so we came back and had a fish fry and sat around the fire some more and told accounts. And then that was on Thursday, so we're supposed to leave Friday. Well, one of the lunatics had the brilliant idea, you know, we better, if we get up at 4, we can get up, get everything packed up, and get out of there, you know, be back at the trailhead by about noon. Well, I mean, in theory, that is true, you know. That something like that actually could happen, but I'm sitting here going, you know, I mean, I'm saying, if these guys can do it, I can do it. So, I mean, but I'm in this late, of course, I got to get up 2 or 3 times a night anyway, check the horses every time they wheeze or gasp or whatever like that, plus things that I need to get up for anyway. And so I figured if they can get up, I can get up, but we'll see. Well, 3:30 in the morning, the guy whose main idea it was that he lobbied hard for it, he's up thrashing around and getting ready. So we all got up in the night in the dark and start moving around, getting the horses tacked up, getting everything ready. Sure enough, by about 8 o'clock in the morning, we're on the trail. And in the cool of the morning, everybody's riding, and just, we're packed up a lot better this time. We had, you know, we didn't have all the food and ice and other kinds of things that we had to bring. And it was a great trip out. We made the trip out in just about 3 hours. And I was riding a little Sundance, and man, she was golden and was stepping out, and it was just, you know, I was leading the way actually with her that most of the way. So it was a fun time. We got back and then, you know, got in the cars and came home, and I had the former Navy SEAL and one of the other big guys in my truck, and man, we hadn't gone hardly 100 yards before they were zonked. So then we made it home. But there were several takeaways, and this is where I felt like it. There are a number of scriptural biblical principles. You know, some sermons are biblical things where you start with a verse or whatever and you explain all the ins and the outs or whatever. Other times there are life illustrations that have biblical, or that the scripture has a lot to say about. And I think most of you are aware enough of the things that I'd like to talk about some of the takeaways. One of the first things about the trip was the kindness and generosity of others. Here was a guy that Jacob got a hold of somehow that was willing to lend him horses, lend him a trailer, lend him his gear and tack to take on a trip into the wilderness. This thing couldn't happen without that. So here is a guy that didn't go on the trip, that was willing, and you know, that's not just something that you do real often. And he did it, and it was one of those things that's another person wanting to make a contribution into the kingdom of God via this particular ministry. And then, you know, when the trailer went down, there was, you know, you can't find anybody to fix a tire. There's no place open to get a tire. Another guy was willing to offer his trailer on no notice to be able to go in. I called a friend of mine who has the Les Schwab store in, because, you know, there's all these things happen at once. How are we going to do? What are we going to do? And he called me back and said, I can go get the truck, and I'll come and, you know, and do whatever needs to be done. Just let me know. So the generosity and the kindness and the willingness of other people to step in and make the kingdom go. Our family has experienced this several times. We've had family reunions, and we've had people in the body here said, here, you want to take our boat and use it for the week? You know, I mean, stuff like that that is just phenomenal. To, you know, to be part of the family. The kingdom of God can only move forward on the willingness of the people of God. In the nation of Israel, when the children of Israel were bringing in the tithes and the offerings and all that stuff, the priests and the Levites were cared for, the kingdom went out, the word of God went out, revival could go. A generation would come along and stop doing that, and all of the priests and Levites had to go farming or doing whatever else they were doing, and they would fall into complete disarray. You know, it's the generosity of God's people that makes things go. And I don't know how God has orchestrated everything, but I know this from history as well as, you know, what I see in Scripture, that when God's people are obedient, the kingdom is able to advance. If God's people slack off and decide just to do their own thing, the candlestick can be removed. I look at Turkey today. I think there's maybe like 1% of the people Christians. That's where the 7 churches of the Revelation were. The Apostle Paul spent his ministry there. The kingdom of God was there, and yet today, almost nothing. The same thing can happen in America. If God's people decide to slack off and take every part of life for granted, the things we have did not come by accident. And they can go away very, very stinking quickly. The same thing can happen right here on a smaller scale in Flathead Ekklesia. If God's people, for whatever reason, decide simply to take a vacation from God and the family, the thing will go belly up, and it can happen very rapidly. There's something about the way God has put together His body and the kingdom that requires the involvement, the kindness, the generosity of all of His people, all of His body, to make the rest of it flow. You know, whether it's feeding the Flathead, whether it's a Ray of Hope, whether it's Flathead Ekklesia, whether it's Tend the Fire Ministries, all are dependent upon God's people stepping into the gap and sacrificing and giving and helping, and everyone carrying the load. It matters. Second thing I want you to just kind of ponder is the necessity of vision. You know, Jacob had been blowing and going and making a lot of money in Southern California when the wheels came off in his business. But there was a remarkable story of God speaking into his life. He went in to see his pastor once and was telling him about all the problems, and his pastor started smiling at him. He said he just about went across the desk and took out his lights. He said, "What in the world are you? I mean, I'm in trouble here. I mean, I am being sued for millions of dollars. I mean, I am just in deep weeds here, and you're smiling? You know, what's up with that?" You know, and the pastor was saying, listen, God knows what he's doing. God is with us. God will bring you through and all that stuff. But out of that trauma, he began to feel a calling into full-time ministry in this other area. And it's out of that kind of a vision that this trip happened, all the rest of the stuff happened, and who knows how eternity will be impacted by that. We don't know, but there's a vision. When it came time to plant Flathead Ekklesia, you know, there were those who had a vision to say, let's make something happen. You know, I remember Rob and Gary particularly, and others that we began to talk about, you know, said, okay, we think it's time to do this. Well, I don't know. We know of several people that have been saved right here among us and have now gone on to be with the Lord. That would not have happened without Flathead Ekklesia having been born, without us staying in the game. You know what I'm saying? So there's a vision that is required. And again, we all need to latch on to the vision. Then there's a need for a plan. It's interesting how, I mean, you can't do feeding the Flathead without a plan. If we just said, hey, let's get together and do a feeding the Flathead, and then let's just show up, nothing would happen. But there's a plan for menus, and there's a plan for this, and how we're going to cook, and how we're going to do that, and who's going to actually be there to do it, and all those things. There's a plan that is needed. And Jacob was planning, I was having to plan my side of the thing, other people were planning to get here, all those things, a need for a plan. As we meet for leadership, that's what we need to be doing from time to time. We just, okay, how do we move forward? What do we need to do? There's a need for a plan. Another key takeaway was the tenacity of hanging in there in the midst of adversity. Oftentimes, I think when things get tough, we want to quit. Or sometimes we put religious terms on it and say, well, if things are getting tough, it must not be the Lord's will. God must not want me to do this thing because it's hard. But oftentimes, it's in the darkness, it's in the challenge, it's in the pain, you know, it's even in the discomfort that God is most able to accomplish something significant. If there were no pain, there would never be the joy when the pain is gone. You know, most everyone here has suffered adversity and challenge and pain that you wish you didn't have to go through. But it's often in those times of trauma that God speaks comfort into our soul. And God comforts us in our affliction so that we are able to comfort others in their affliction. Someone that has faced the loss of a child is able to stand beside someone else who is going through that with a whole different level of street creds than somebody who is saying, there, it'll all be fine. You know, and the same is true of all of the traumas of life, that we are to live life together, encouraging one another, and facing the adversity, facing it together, and overcoming. Our trip, I would certainly not have written the script this way. But without some of the pain, without some of the drama, without some of the trauma, the sweetness on the other side would not have been nearly as significant. You know, and so that, and I was just amazed at the tenacity of some of the guys. We got the pre-trip cancer going on. It'd have been easy to pull the pin and say, man, I just can't do this. You know, the gathering the horses, the tack from all the others, the borrowed trailer, the flat tire, the sickness, the heat, untrained people, grain and unruly horses, the guys having to step up in a foreign world. See, that does not appeal to a lot of folk. But there are a lot of men particularly that long for the adventure. They long for the challenge. They long for something to make life richer and fuller, you know? And the reward comes kind of at the top of the mountain, not necessarily just in the grind up the mountain. Another takeaway was the overcoming of fear. I just came to find out later on, one of the guys was just terrified of bears. Well, we never even saw a bear, whatever. But it came anyway, knowing he's coming into bear country. You know? I mean, that's an overcoming of the fear. One of the guys had just almost a paralyzing fear of horses. And I didn't know that. The guy's a cop, you know, and I just thought he'd be pretty athletic, pretty active, no problem, just do this, give him directions. And he would have been fine had he been able to do that, but I did not know he was just incapable of doing that, you know. But as a result of that, still he overcame his fear, and as he came out the last day, was able to go, yeah, you know, I did this. I faced my fear, I overcame. I mean, that's life stuff, you know. Another was the lesson in living in community. Everyone had to step up and help. When the guys were sick, the other guys just had to jump in. They had to carry the load. They had to do things that was out of their comfort zone. And there's a lot of work. Boy, you know, when you're stepping off into the bob, you know, you don't just have your pickup there where you can go run to your pickup and get all the other stuff that you thought you might need. I mean, whatever you launch off with at the trailhead, that's what you've got. So, I mean, there was sawing wood, there was cutting wood, there was building a fire, there was getting water, it's amazing how much energy and effort it takes just to take care of food and water and, you know, heat and all that stuff. I mean, there's a lot of effort to it. But these guys, it was just phenomenal. I mean, here are these guys from Southern California dealing in the realm of finance, you know, wearing suits all day. And they're out there, man, they're cutting wood. And then they're trying to chop wood. I mean, it's hilarious watching, you know. But they are really gung-ho, man. They want to, you know, they want to chop wood. Never probably chopped wood in their lives. Had a pretty big old saw that I packed on one of my saw horses, my pack horses, and they were wanting to saw logs, which I'm all for them, man. God bless them, everyone, you know. If they do, I don't have to, you know. Going to the river to get water by yourself, you know, or whatever. Just all of these different things, because the purpose was to get men, get them to be in a position where we could get the gospel to them, talk about the significance of family, talk about the significance of, you know, trying to love their wives and love their kids and what's important. And I think all of those things were able to come through crystal clear. Whereas if you had simply sat them in a church building and said, okay guys, here's what, you know, would be a good thing to do, you have a dramatically different situation. But overcoming fear and living in community. There's another set of lessons that I think we need, and that is the difference between the anticipation and the reality. You ever plan a great, wonderful, glorious trip? We're going to go to Yellowstone Park, or whatever it is we're going to do, right? And so we have this vision of, you know, the idyllic wild and sitting out there and, you know, sipping a Coke and looking at the mountains and, you know, whatever, right? Okay. Well, often when we get to the reality, then there's mosquitoes, you know, and dirt and mud and or rain or whatever, right? I mean, you've had that kind of experience, right? You've got this ideal vision of what you expect it to be, and then when you get there, the reality is profoundly different. Well, I'm sure that happened a great deal on this trip, as it does in life. And the reality is oftentimes hard work, sweat, heat, cold, you know, trouble, problems, blisters, you know, all of those things. And so, but we need to recognize that that's how life is. You know, you got the fantasy, and then you have the reality. But you know, there's another piece to that. Sometimes the reality is way, way cooler than even the imagination. You know, when we got to the top of Prairie Reef and we were able to look out over the whole world and able to see the glory of God, you know, I mean, the guys were blown away, as of course I was, but I had seen it before, but still, every time you see it, it's an amazing thing. Or you're sitting around a campfire and the stars are stunningly glorious. And you hear the howl of wolves off in the distance. I mean, the guys just were in awe. Now, the howling of wolves has a little different connotation to guys from Southern California than for hunters in Montana, you know. But still, it's pretty stinking cool. Or even the idea, you know, the romantic idea of John Wayne riding off into the sunset on his horse, you know, with a lovely maiden beside him that he's just beat up everybody in the world to get and all that stuff, you know. I mean, that's, you know, but when you've been able to actually be on the horse and you turn the horse and the horse turns, and you pull and the horse stops, and you cluck and the horse goes, and you are saying, I got dominion over this 1,200-pound animal. I can, you know, there's a connection and a something about it that is just so stinking cool that you can't imagine it until you're there. So sometimes the fantasy is way better than the reality, and sometimes the reality is just way better than the imagination. I think most everybody that has ever gone to a Tres Dias, for example, also has experienced the thought that I could not have imagined. I thought this, I've been to conferences, I've had people tell me I've been to 100 conferences, man. I've been to Promise Keepers, I've been everywhere there is to go, and you know, there's nothing that can be this cool. And about Saturday night or whatever, they begin to go, wow. I'm blessed, I'm stirred, I'm touched, you know, by the reality of God's presence. So the reality is even better than the vision oftentimes. And perhaps a final note that we need to remember, I need to remember, and my suspicion is that you need to remember, is the significance, the necessity, the power of prayer. You know, if you're like me, you know, we often pray before a meal, and it can end up being rub-a-dub-dub, thanks for the grub, yay God, or whatever, more or less. You know what I'm saying? I mean, but when the fat hits the fire, and there are problems in our work, problems in our business, problems here or there, whatever it is that we're encountering, how often do we allow ourselves just to worry and stew and fret and get agitated? when what we really need to do is stop, back away, call upon the Lord, allow Him to calm our heart, our mind, our spirit, and get a sense of direction. And it was really a pretty dramatic thing to me. And it was mentioned several times by the guys throughout the week that when the wheels were just coming off everywhere, we stopped, had prayer, called upon the Lord. It just kind of calmed the waters, and we were able to move forward in a lot better fashion. I believe that God wants us to be dependent upon Him more. And our mantra in the flesh is, why pray when you can worry? Why pray when you can fret? With God, it needs to be, why worry? Why fret? Why stew when you can pray? And we need to remember that. So the trip was a great, it was a great trip. I think eternity alone will reveal the positive results. I would have attempted to do some things differently had I had a little more occasion, but God was able, I think, to bring victory from the jaws of defeat, and we all came back alive, had some great conversations, just some fascinating God moments that came along, and bless the Lord.